reporting that its military also launched missiles toward enemy targets. Kuwait's army says that air defenses are responding to drone threats, and in Bahrain saying that their air raid sirens have been activated. Meanwhile, the U.S. military is reporting the death of another American service member who was killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. Here's what President Trump had to say about the recent strikes and these troop fatalities.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots are out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little left. They've got some missiles. They've got some drones. They've got some manufacturing ability, not much. We control the Strait. They don't control anything. So we'll see what happens, but we hit them very hard again tonight.
Let's go to CNN's Leila Garagozlu live from Abu Dhabi as she continues to cover this. So Leila, give us a sense of where some of these strikes have actually been focused.
Yeah, so as you said, it is the 9th consecutive day of strikes between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. said that it hit a number of Iranian military targets Sunday night into today, Monday morning. Now, Iranian state media said that there were explosions heard across the southern region of Iran, as well as in the northwestern region of Iran, close to the city of Tabriz. Now, that would be the first time in these 9 days that we're hearing any sort of explosions in that area. Earlier on in this war, in the early months, much of the U.S. and Israeli strikes were focused on the more inland cities like Tehran, Esfahan, and Tabriz. This time around, in these 9 days, these strikes have been really focused on the southern region. Now, the southern region is considered to be Iran's defensive arch. These cities like Bandar Abbas, Ahvaz, and also these islands like Qeshm Island and Harg Island really are part of the way that Iran is able to control the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that's why we're seeing the U.S. really focus its strikes in this southern region. Now, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and who controls it, the IRGC says that the Iranians still control it and that they've closed it. The UK Maritime Authority said that it got a report of a vessel on fire, and the Revolutionary Guards said that they had 2 tankers that they found to be non-compliant and therefore targeted. So really asserting their control over the strait. Now, we're in a very fragile situation between the U.S. and Iran, and there's some serious concern among analysts that I've spoken to about this escalating and expanding if no off-ramp is found. So we're going to have to see what happens over the next week. Paulo?
All right, Leila Garagozlu, thank you so much for all that reporting. As always, appreciate your time. Let's go now to Nega Anga joining me now. She's a visiting fellow with King's College London, and she was a senior advisor at the U.S. State Department and National Security Council. Thank you so much for joining us, Nega. Great to see you again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. So after the U.S. and Iran, they traded strikes for a 9th straight night, as you just heard in Leila's report. Do you see any potential off-ramps right now? I mean, a question that so many are asking, what would de-escalation actually look like?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I think we have to be very realistic. We can't look for some sort of grand political agreement, not even anything close to what the Memorandum of Understanding looked like just a week or so ago. What we need to sort of look for is some sort of emergency operating arrangement for the Hormuz. And I think that's where you're going to have sort of those back channel diplomatic conversations to try to find a solution to essentially the Strait of Hormuz, how it's going to operate, the recognized sort of shipping lanes, who monitors, who clears it, all of those technical details, and essentially kind of like a freeze for freeze sort of approach, so that we move away from, essentially what looks like punishment becoming a strategy. So I do think there is, a small window, and there is that diplomatic off-ramp there. The only sort of disconcerting factor is, there is so much direct military friction right now that this could this could be a slippery slope into something much larger.
So if in fact there are some of those back channel conversations that you referenced, I'm just curious, who do you think are some of those parties in addition to the U.S. and Iran? Do you think that some of the Gulf nations would be potentially involved?
Absolutely. The mediators need to continue to stay involved. They have obviously a lot of domestic and personal interest in making sure that the fighting halts. But it's going to require quite a bit of that shuttle diplomacy. They're going to have to be going back and forth between both capitals to try to convince them that they need to come to the table to discuss. The issue is, and it's the idea of trying to convince both parties that you are losing this window of opportunity. Once this window closes, it's going to be very hard to find a diplomatic off-ramp. An off-ramp is always possible. It's just, how do you not lose face in front of your domestic audience? And that window is quite small, both for the United States, but also for Iran, who is under a lot of economic constraints right now. So again, the mediators are going to have to be involved. Mediators can range from, obviously Pakistan, Qatar, and all the other regional countries who are being directly impacted by these volleying attacks taking place over the last week or so.
Let's talk a little bit more about this clear widening of this conflict. Nega, we already know that a Kuwaiti power and desalination plant was struck by Iran for the second time, actually, and the U.S. striking Iranian sites like bridges and power stations. So does this targeting of that kind of infrastructure, do you think that it increases the risk for civilians in the region? Is that something that we should now be seriously worried about?
We definitely should be. Again, I think the objectives in some ways have been quite clear, right? On the United States side, the immediate objectives were clear, punish attacks on U.S. personnel, protect commercial shipping, reduce Iran's coastal capacity to control or threaten the strait. So, it's very clear why they have these very specific targeted attacks. A lot of times they see them as, military infrastructure, that are important key sites. For Iran's behavior, it's very clear that they're basically saying that we're being reactive. We are showing the same kind of proportional attacks against the United States that it's causing to us. So we see sort of both sides and what they're trying to do. The issue is that each side is ramping up their attacks, hoping that will convince the other side to change their course in the negotiations and come to the table. Obviously, again, when you have these direct military frictions, there are going to be a slippage. It will move past certain red lines. This is where civilians will be impacted. And at this point in time, we're talking about civilians in third countries, in the Gulf countries in and around Iran, and not necessarily, there's obviously direct U.S. personnel, but not necessarily on the U.S. homeland. And so this is going to be a huge concern because there is no guarantee when you have this kind of tit for tat that it's going to push each of the adversaries back towards the negotiating table. Again, I think this is why you're going to be seeing a lot of these countries who are directly impacted, working the phones, having the various conversations because they need to ensure the security and safety of their own citizens.
The war between the U.S. and Iran shows no signs of slowing down. U.S. President Donald Trump says Iran was hit very hard after a 9th consecutive night of U.S. strikes. The Pentagon has also confirmed an American service member has been killed in Iraq during the detonation of a downed Iranian drone. Meanwhile, there are new attacks on shipping as a vessel burns off the coast of Oman after being struck by an unknown projectile. Despite the heavy exchange of fire, both Washington and Tehran say they remain open to diplomacy. I want to bring in CNN senior White House reporter Kevin Liptak, and we also have CNN producer Leila Gagazoglu joining us now. Great to have both of you with me. Kevin, I want to start off with you. And President Trump says Iran was hit very hard. And yet, in all of this, where we've seen escalation over the last 9 days, There's talk about diplomacy perhaps still being alive. Is there a realistic path back to negotiations?
I think there is, if both sides of this come to the recognition that, this is very quickly spiraling in a way that would be very difficult to control. And so I think you do hear people, and I think it's notable who you're hearing it from, which are the diplomats on either side of this, suggesting that they view a way back to the negotiating table. You heard Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying that Iran was actually communicating both directly and indirectly that it wanted to negotiate. And you hear from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Arghachi, as well, saying that the negotiations could begin, quote, when you have achieved reliable battlefield and strategic gains. I think the question is whether the political decision makers on either side of this see a pathway back to talks. And President Trump, for his part, has suggested over the last couple of weeks that he doesn't view the Iranians as credible negotiators and that he thinks there is a job to be finished militarily. And so whether he really views a pathway to diplomacy here, I think, is an open question. And you have seen escalating strikes from both sides. Last night, Central Command saying that it had carried out the 9th straight night of attacks on Iran. And you see both the U.S. and Iran increasingly going after some sensitive civilian infrastructure, including water desalination plants, power plants. On the U.S.'s part, it's been striking roads and bridges in southern Iran, which I think is leading to some anxieties that it is preparing for some sort of ground invasion there. And I think even the deaths that you have seen over the course of the last several days just indicates that even absent a ground invasion by the United States, the American troops remain very much in harm's way. The vast military installations that are arrayed across the Middle East. And I think those deaths really pose some very serious questions for President Trump about where precisely he sees all of this heading, as the cost for Americans, both in terms of gas prices and energy, but also in terms of American lives, seems to be increasing.
Yeah. All right, Kevin, thank you so much for that. Layla, I want to turn to how we've seen major escalation over the last few days, 9 days, in fact, retaliation between both sides. We've seen U.S. service members that have been killed as well, vessels under attack in the Strait of Hormuz. There is concern that the range and scope of this war is widening into a far bigger regional war. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so I think both sides are very concerned about this escalation and potential expansion. Over the last 9 days, we've basically seen the U.S. focus its strikes on that southern region of Iran, what is considered to be the defensive arch in Iran, these coastal cities and islands that allow Iran to hold control of the strait. Now, if the U.S. expands inward, and we have heard reports of explosions near Tabriz, you could see the Iranians also escalate and expand their range of targets throughout the region, meaning that this situation is quite fragile and we could see it escalate very, very quickly. Now, over the weekend, the IRGC, through a number of different Iranian channels, basically said that if the U.S. escalates, they're going to respond in kind. They're very big on proportionality and proportional responses. This is something that we've seen with the Iranians in 2020, 2024, 2025. So it's really going to come down to whether these two sides can kind of tone down and de-escalate, if they can find an off-ramp. Otherwise, we are headed to a much wider conflict.
Yeah, very quickly, in terms of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, because there's major concern that the Houthis will be activated to also, block the strait there, which is obviously a lifeline for a lot of the oil that is exported out of Saudi Arabia. Where are we with that? Yeah,
so we are hearing that the Yemeni armed forces could be closing the Bab el-Mandeb. If they do, it's obviously going to throw another wrench into the oil markets and what's going on. Obviously, the strait, according to the Iranians, remains closed. So any more pressure on the market is obviously going to impact market prices, the average person, rising cost.
All right. The U.S. and Iran is escalating across the Middle East. Kuwait says its air defenses responded to drone threats on Sunday as attacks spread across the Gulf. President Trump says Iran was hit very hard after a 9th consecutive night of U.S. strikes. All this comes after 3 U.S. service members were killed over the weekend in Iranian attacks.
Well, we feel very badly, but those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily.
All right, despite the intensifying fighting, both Washington and Tehran say they may remain open to diplomacy. CNN's Stephen Collinson joins us now from Washington. Stephen, really good to see you. I mean, what a crazy 9 days it's been. I mean, the escalation ladder has been climbing and climbing. I wonder how the deaths of these U.S. service members is going to play with the American public, as we see, even though they're talking about perhaps diplomacy still being very much alive, there's major concerns that this could, become a wider war.
Elena, this was already a deeply unpopular war in the United States. And I think the fact that American service members have been dying over the weekend is going to sharpen questions about what exactly the president's endgame is here and how does he get towards it. I've already seen some messaging from various political groups this morning, which is saying that as the president shared a luxury box at the FIFA World Cup final with Gianni Infantino, Americans were dying in the Middle East. This is something I think you will probably see start to filter in Democratic arguments as we get closer to the midterm elections if this war continues. Right now, we are not anywhere near the level of casualties on the U.S. side that were caused in the Afghan and Iraq wars earlier in the century. And that did have a great political impact. And of course, there are often in these conflicts many more civilians on the other side who are killed. We should remember that. So while tragic, the troop deaths are still fairly low. But the memory of Iraq and Afghanistan is very deep in the DNA of U.S. politics. It was one reason why the president first won office in 2016 when he took the White House. So I think it would not take too much for all of that to be revived and to make the war even less popular among Americans and more of a millstone for Republican candidates in the midterm elections in November.
All right, we've got Nick Robertson as well joining us. Nick, really good to see you. The last few days in the region have been absolutely, scary for many people here across the region. Give us an idea on the diplomacy front and whether there is a potential off-ramp to end this.
It's not clear where that off-ramp is. It's not clear that either side wants to take it. They both do say, the United States and Iran do say that they're open to diplomacy. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that today. You've had the foreign ministry spokesman in Tehran saying that again, but also saying that they're not, that Iran is not supporting the MOU, is not working to sort of further its diplomatic efforts. It is parked on one side. Today you have the Iranian Interior Minister on his way to Pakistan to meet his counterpart there, who's been really at the forefront of the mediation efforts between the United States and Iran. So does that represent, a chance here for some diplomacy to get a little bit of traction? Look, the key thing at the moment is that Iran wants to prove, and it did last night by hitting a tanker or appearing to hit a tanker close to Oman, that it controls the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States seems determined militarily to send a message that it can't, and the military path would just have to continue to erode Iran's ability to hit the shipping and damage it going through the Strait of Hormuz. That's where it's at. But diplomatically, this does feel like one of those moments where many in the Gulf states, the diplomats there, they don't say it publicly, but they're concerned about what is the end goal here of the United States. How is it going to achieve it? Can it achieve it? And if there isn't a quick resolution, therefore diplomacy has to take over. But that said, it's not, the diplomatic off-ramp is out there somewhere. Of course it is, but it doesn't seem to be within sight of where we stand today.
Yeah, and we saw how quickly the MOU basically was unraveled. Stephen, I want you to listen to what U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had to say last night.
I think we're always open to diplomacy. It has to be real. It has to be a deal that they're willing to live by. Look, Iran a week ago was supposed to put out a statement saying that the Straits of Hormuz would be open, that they would no longer attack shipping. And instead of doing that, they attacked 3 ships. I think that was last Friday or Saturday. So, I mean, their behavior has to change in order for ours to change.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting because, again, the Strait of Hormuz is being mentioned. Open up the Strait. Iran has a different perspective, Stephen, about what happens in the Strait. Does President Trump sound like someone who actually wants to resume diplomatic talks? Does he act like it?
Well, 9 days of attacks on Iranian targets seem to indicate that he's not willing to go down that path right now. One interpretation of it is that he's trying to do so much damage that Iran has no choice to come back to the negotiating table. That seems unlikely, at least in the short term, and because of the history of the conflict. It seems like there are factions in Iran that almost welcome this renewal of the war, and they are never intending to give up that leverage they have on the Strait of Hormuz. What the administration has not done is explain to any of us why this round of attacks is likely to make it more likely that Iran would capitulate than the weeks of more intense attacks that it conducted with the Israelis earlier in the war. Does there come a point when they can do so much damage along the Iranian side of the strait that handicaps Iran's ability to mount these strikes? I think there's a lot of doubt about that in the US and especially in Congress right now, at a time when the administration is going to Congress to try and get more money for the war, because as we know, all it takes is a few missiles or a few drones to shut down the strait again entirely. So how we get from this point to a point where diplomacy might be a possibility without Trump stepping back, as he did in the past, and as Iran may be assuming he will do in the future, is a real question. And until then, I think the diplomatic and the economic costs will continue to pile up.
Yeah, they absolutely are. Nick, we saw strikes on Kuwait. Desalination as well as a power plant, Bahrain, Jordan, first time in Syria, strikes there, as well as Iraq. Regional countries here targeted in the latest round of Iran.
Kuwait, because it's close. Bahrain, because it's close. Both have strong ties. Bahrain has the naval base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Kuwait has multiple air bases that the United States has been using to help prosecute the war against Iran. So Iran has a lot of short-range ballistic missiles. Because Bahrain and Kuwait are close to Iran, the missiles can get there quickly. They're harder to stop. Iran can afford to send a lot of these missiles. If it's looking at a long-range war that could last, outwards of months, a month or more here, they do need to think about what weapon systems they're using. These are also seen as sort of the weaker of the Gulf states, if you will. We're aware that over the recent months, countries like Qatar, the UAE, Saudi have all had bilateral conversations with the Iranians. We don't know what has been worked out behind the scenes there. We know that they've been attacked, but less so than Bahrain and Kuwait. So Iran's able to inflict damage there, particularly, as you mentioned, Kuwait hitting the desalination plant. The Minister for Electricity and Water went out to that plant over the weekend. Also, the hitting of that oil, the oil facility there in Kuwait, a strategic hit for Iran, if you will. It was significant damage to vital equipment. That's what the Kuwaitis said. But look, Jordan, that has really come front and center for Iran. And we don't know the disposition of U.S. military hardware in the region, but Iran says, over the last week or so, they've had multiple strikes at different U.S. aircraft, whether it's helicopters, whether it's location storing other aircraft. We know that there have been the refuel tankers based there in the past. They said over the weekend that they hit a C-17 and an Orion P-8 surveillance aircraft. It's not clear that that is true or just a claim. But it does seem that Jordan is coming in the crossfire here more, or the crosshairs more, because they have a lot of U.S. military assets there that are being used in the war, and Iran has figured out either a better system of targeting them, or perhaps the defenses in Jordan are just not able to withstand the amount of firepower that's coming from Iran at the moment. So that's really put a lot of focus there, and Iran would like nothing better, its stated aim, chase the United States from the region. You saw them attacking Aqaba airport over the weekend. There were security alerts about that over the weekend. This is a place which is bustling with tourists at this time of year. It undermines the local economy, it puts pressure on the Jordanian government, and it makes people there worried about what's next for them. And Iran knows that, and it calculates that.
Yeah, Stephen, I mean, and Nick makes a really good point. Initially, this war is going to last 4 to 6 weeks. And I think every expert I spoke to said, and I'm sure you've had sort of the same feedback, it's that this has got to end before the midterm elections. Can it? Will it? Is that sort of a big priority for President Trump?
I think that Trump would clearly like to end it before the midterm elections in November. The assumption is in Washington that he really wants to get out of this war still. But at the same time, if he walks away and Iran is still controlling the Strait of Hormuz, that is a massive strategic defeat for the United States. And for Trump personally, it will be a presidency again foundering in the waters of the Persian Gulf, if you like, that we've seen previously in the United States. And that could make things very difficult for him going forward in terms of his prestige personally and American power. So this is sharpening into a massive dilemma for Trump. And it's not just November, I think we should talk about. Advance voting in US elections in some states gets going as early as late September through October. Generally, the opinions ahead of US elections crystallize in the late summer period. If we're going to another month of $4 gasoline in the United States, which doesn't sound an awful lot elsewhere in the world, but is punitive for American drivers, especially considering a lot of the distances people have to commute to work, etc., that could be a real political point. And I think it's clear that Iran is just as aware of the political pressures on Trump as everyone in Washington is. But again, it comes back to that fundamental question. How does he get out of this? How does he get to an end game? How do they get to a point that Nick was saying where the diplomatic off-ramp is even coming into view? That is the stalemate we're in. And as much as President Trump might like a lot of things to happen, and a lot of his messaging almost seems to be wish casting throughout this war, the facts on the ground are those that unusually he can't reinvent and create a narrative to support his position.
Including the latest from the Middle East. Just in the last hour, the United States military says it launched a wave of new strikes against Iran. It marks 9 straight nights of strikes and comes after 3 U.S. service members were killed in action this weekend. CNN's Julia Benbrook joins us now with the latest from the administration. And Julia, what are you hearing about where things stand tonight?
Well, the latest is that the United States is carrying out another round of strikes against Iran. U.S. Central Command recently in a statement said this, that CENTCOM began conducting a new wave of strikes against Iran at 7 p.m. Eastern today. This is the 9th consecutive night. The strikes will continue degrading Iranian military capabilities used to attack commercial vessels and civilian mariners transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This continues days of escalation in the region. Again, this is the 9th consecutive night of U.S. strikes, and there have been waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets at countries with U.S. bases. This also comes after, on Friday, 2 U.S. service members were killed during an attack in Jordan, and 1 service member was categorized as missing in action. They're providing a bit more information there as well, saying that remains were found in that area. They are waiting to verify some of that information, though. And then on Saturday, there was a U.S. service member killed, this time in northern Iraq. And they said that that happened during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. This brings the total number of U.S. service members killed during this now nearly 5-month-long conflict to 17. So there are concerns that this could grow into an even wider conflict. We have not heard President Donald Trump comment directly on these most recent developments after the 2 service members were killed in Jordan. He did give a few brief phone interviews. He told the New York Post that he would speak with their families at some some point, and he told News Nation that it is a very sad thing. It is in service to our country. And then he reiterated a point that he has made throughout this conflict. He said that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. So there are a lot of questions here about his strategy going forward. He is now traveling back to Washington, D.C. He spent his weekend here in New Jersey, of course, played a role there in that World Cup game at MetLife Stadium. And that's really a time when a lot of eyes are on not only him, but the United States as a whole. So waiting on a comment from him here.
And President Trump is speaking right now on his way back to Washington. Let's take a quick listen.
4 or 5 weeks. Well, you keep hitting me. This is a far bigger job that we're doing. We were doing a little job of stopping them from having a certain capability. Now we're just ending it. So it's really not the same thing. What we're doing now is we're ending any chance where they could have a nuclear missile. If you look at it, after a week and a half, not 4 weeks, a week and a half, 2 weeks, we stopped them from probably, but I don't want to have the word probably. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
All right, that was President Trump speaking at Joint Base Andrews on his way back to Washington, D.C. after attending the World Cup final. We've got our team standing by, Julia Benbrook for us, a White House correspondent, and retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton as well. And Julia, I just want to start with you because we had heard from Central Command leading into the president's comments today that the United States was launching new strikes, that this was the 9th consecutive night of strikes, and the president claiming Iran has been very badly damaged. Did anything else stick out to you from what the president said there?
Well, you hear him there just at the end saying they cannot have a nuclear weapon. Again, we've heard him repeat that over and over again throughout this nearly 5-month-long conflict now. And we heard Energy Secretary Chris Wright speaking earlier today about the conflict as a whole, as well as the Strait of Hormuz and how it's impacting shipping. And he was adamant that Trump wants to find a diplomatic off-ramp, a diplomatic solution here. But what has been clear so far is that that has not been successful. We have seen this just really ramp up in recent days. As you pointed out, it's the 9th consecutive night now of U.S. strikes. We've also seen waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. And there are fears that this could turn into a much wider conflict. It's been just over a month since there was this hope for a diplomatic breakthrough. The Memorandum of Understanding was signed by both the United States and Iran. But in recent days, Trump has said that in his opinion, that Memorandum of Understanding is, quote, over. And then, of course, these deaths of the U.S. service members on Friday. 2 U.S. service members were killed in an attack in Jordan, and another was categorized as missing in action. They did say today that they have found remains in that area, but they are working on the verification process there. And then another U.S. service member was killed in action on Saturday, that time in northern Iraq. But, of course, bringing this a lot closer to home. That brings the number of U.S. service members who have been killed in this months-long conflict to 17. And those are some of the first remarks that we're seeing on camera from Trump himself about what's taken place over the weekend in this recent escalation.
And Colonel Leighton, you know, we heard the president there saying that, confirming, of course, what we heard from Central Command in the strikes tonight, saying we hit them very hard again tonight in honor of those killed, of the service members killed. There were questions, obviously, of how the United States was going to respond as we got the news of the service members killed. But how does that sort of change the calculation ahead for the U.S. in terms of not just strikes, but strategy overall?
Yeah, Omar, it's a question that's actually a really pertinent one here, because what you're looking at is if there is an escalation of this type, every time that a U.S. service member is killed or injured, that there's another strike in Iran, and then Iranians are killed as a result of that. That is really that escalation ladder that we talk about every now and then. And it really becomes almost not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but almost a never-ending cycle.
Including the United States military saying another U.S. service member was killed this weekend in northern Iraq. And this comes as the United States and Iran keep up fresh strikes against each other amid fears of a wider war rising in the region. The United States launching a new wave of attacks on Iran after 2 U.S. service members were killed by an Iranian strike in Jordan on Friday. And Iran is intensifying its attacks on U.S. allies in the Gulf region. Kuwait, for example, says Iran hit one of its power and water plants for the second time in 2 days. These are the kind of plants that are critical for providing fresh water to parts of the region. And defense has also intercepted strikes in Jordan and Bahrain. So joining me now is CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson in Jerusalem, and CNN's Julia Benbrook is traveling with the president as well. So Julia, I just want to start with you. What is the latest we are hearing from the Trump administration?
Well, just a day after U.S. Central Command announced that 2 American service members had been killed during an attack in Jordan, CENTCOM now says that another American service member has been killed in action, this time in northern Iraq. I want to pull up this statement for you now. They did provide a few more details, saying a U.S. service member in northern Iraq was killed in action July 18th during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. A second service member was wounded and continues to receive medical treatment for a minor injury. This brings the total of deaths of U.S. service members during this now nearly 5-month-long conflict to 17. And as I mentioned before, that happened just the day after 2 American service members were killed during an attack in Jordan. They also said that 1 other service member had been categorized as missing in action. They provided a bit more of an update there as well, saying that remains were found in that area, but the examination process, the verification process is still ongoing. CENTCOM is still withholding some information here as they are working to make sure that next of kin is notified. But all of this happening as there are fears that this could turn into a much wider conflict. The U.S. has launched 8 consecutive nights of strikes, and then there have been waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. Omar?
And Nick, what has the reaction in the region been like to these latest strikes?
Yeah, we're hearing about some levels of diplomacy, the Saudis, others talking about how this current sort of spate of conflict can avoid an escalation. If we go back to what was happening at the end of March, in the early part of April, in the very beginning of the sort of ceasefire back then, these Gulf countries got very worried when it appeared that the United States was about to step up military actions again as it was trying to sort of force open the Strait of Hormuz. And what they didn't understand back then was precisely what the United States was planning. And you get a sense that some of that's permeating the region again. Bahrain today intercepting missiles fired at it. Kuwait, as you mentioned, intercepting missiles fired at it again. They've really been caught in some of the most direct and intense barrages coming from Iran so far. But it really, I think it is Israel and Jordan where we've seen this possibility of a real increase in the scale and potential scope of the current hostilities. And that's quite simply because Iran today targeted the southern Jordanian port city of Aqaba. And just a couple of hours before that, the U.S. embassy in Jordan had warned Americans, don't go to Aqaba International Airport, don't go to Aqaba seaport there, because there is credible information about the possibility of attack. Now, Jordanian officials said they weren't aware of that, but within a couple of hours, 4 missiles came from Iran, 3 were intercepted, 1 fell in a deserted area. But during this, because Aqaba is right next to Eilat, Israel's port city at the top of the Red Sea, they both sit there at the top of the Red Sea side by side. Israel activated its air defense systems, and indeed the IDF say that they were involved in helping bring down the attack on southern Jordan. And why this causes concern: as far as we know, there are no U.S. military bases around Aqaba. Aqaba is very busy for tourists at this time of year. Jordan has really been caught in Iran's crosshairs a lot over recent days, not just the killing of several U.S. service members there over the past few days, but multiple different bases U.S. Air Force operates out of in Jordan. The Iranians claim to have attacked. So this appears to be an escalation, and easy to see how the spillover can happen. And Israel's defense minister today said clearly, if Iran attacks, Israel will respond automatically. That's the sort of escalation everyone in this region wants to avoid.
Yeah, Nick Robertson, Julia Benbrook, really appreciate the reporting on both fronts. I want to talk about this more with CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Layton. And look, we are seeing more U.S. troops killed, and this war does seem to be intensifying. If it continues to escalate, what might that actually look like in terms of a next step here?
Omar, it really depends on if the strategies stay the same, but the basic idea would be that there would be an expansion of more raids on the southern part of Iran, and those raids could then be expanded to other parts of Iran. I could see, for example, that CENTCOM would probably target installations in and around Tehran, and that would, of course, be going after headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military elements, the security services, and frankly, the leadership. So
on up to 3. U.S. Central Command says one American service member died yesterday in Iraq during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone, while 2 other U.S. troops were killed on Friday in Jordan from an Iranian attack. This comes as strikes intensify between the United States and Iran, prompting fears that this war could evolve into a wider conflict. I want to bring in CNN's Julia Benbrook, who is traveling with the president this weekend. And Julia, let's just start with what is the latest from the administration right now?
Well, we have not heard publicly from President Donald Trump about these latest developments. As we've been speaking about, he was just at the World Cup final there in MetLife Stadium. He helped with the awards ceremony, and then he'll be heading back to Washington, D.C. soon. But it was just yesterday that U.S. Central Command announced that 2 American service members had been killed during an attack in Jordan. Now, today, they are announcing that another American service member has been killed in action, this time in northern Iraq. I want to pull up this recent statement for you now. They did go into a bit more detail, saying a U.S. service member in northern Iraq was killed in action July 18th during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. A second service member was wounded and continues to receive medical treatment for a minor injury. This brings the total number of U.S. service members killed during this now nearly 5-month-long conflict to 17. And then that attack in Jordan that killed 2 American service members, they also said that 1 service member was categorized as missing in action. They provided a bit more information there as well, saying that remains were found in that area, but the confirmation process is still going on there. So they're looking for more information as they go through that. But when it comes to CENTCOM, they're withholding some information at this time as they work to make sure the next of kin is notified. But all of this is coming as there is just major escalation in the region. We have seen 8 nights of strikes by the United States, as well as just waves of Iranian drones and missiles that have been fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. So a lot of questions about what's next here. After the attack in Jordan, Trump did give a few brief phone interviews with various outlets. He told the New York Post that he would speak to the families of those that were killed. He also told News Nation that this is a very sad thing. It's in service to our country, and added what he's been saying throughout this conflict, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
All right, Julia Benbrook, appreciate the reporting for us there in New Jersey. We're joined now by CNN national security analyst Alex Pleitsis. He's also director of the Counterterrorism Project at the Atlantic Council. Alex, what is your assessment of where things stand tonight?
So unfortunately, from what I'm hearing from multiple U.S. officials, the number of U.S. wounded is actually far more significant than those killed, which was just mentioned. So in Jordan, it could have been as many as 30. I'm also hearing that U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia and also in Iraq were also hit, and that also storage points for weapons in Iraq may have also been hit. So it seems like the attacks may have actually had damage that have been done on publicly yet by the administration.
Just in the last few minutes, U.S. Central Command says a new wave of airstrikes is underway against Iran. This is the 9th consecutive night, and it comes after CENTCOM reported a U.S. service member was killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. This brings the total to 17 American service members killed in the nearly 5-month war. I want to bring in our panel, CNN political commentator and Democratic strategist Maria Cardona, and Republican strategist and former White House spokesperson during the George W. Bush administration, Pete Seat. U.S. Central Command says 2 service members were killed and another is missing following an Iranian attack in Jordan yesterday. Central Command says it will wait to identify the fallen service members until 24 hours after families are notified. 4 more service members were taken to hospitals in Jordan but have since been discharged, CENTCOM said. These are the first American military deaths from Iranian fire since March. Now, the conflict between the United States and Iran is intensifying. Overnight, the United States carried out its 7th consecutive night of strikes, and Tehran has been targeting U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf. For more on this, I want to bring in CNN's Julia Benbrook, who joins us now from New Jersey, where the president is today. And Julia, has the administration said anything more about these latest casualties?
We have reached out to the White House for comment on this. We have not heard back yet, but Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, he put out a brief statement saying that the sacrifice of these service members only stiffens our resolve. Now, this comes as there have been 7 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes, as well as waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. And we are learning from U.S. Central Command that 2 American service members in Jordan have been killed in action. I want to pull up that statement for you now. CENTCOM said in part, on July 17th, 2 U.S. service members in Jordan were killed in action as U.S. Central Command and partner forces defended against Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks. Additionally, 1 service member is currently missing in action. They added that 4 American service members were medically evacuated, sent to hospitals there in Jordan, and have since been discharged. They are withholding information, identification of those 2 service members that were killed as they work to make sure that next of kin has been notified. But it was just a little bit over a week ago now when Iran had targeted ships in the Strait of Hormuz that President Donald Trump said that he believed that the ceasefire agreement was over. And it's been just about a month since there was all of this hope. There was going to be a diplomatic breakthrough when the memorandum of understanding was signed by both the United States and Iran. In fact, Trump said at the time that he was getting almost everything that he wanted here and that this was a good step forward. He has since said that he believes that memorandum of understanding is over as well. Now, what's next here? That is the big question. And we do know from sources familiar with the matter that Trump has been presented with options about expanding military operations in Iran. That was before these 2 service members were killed, and included a Situation Room meeting that really centered around the critical waterway, the Strait of Hormuz, and how to loosen Iran's grip on that area. Americans have so far been skeptical of Trump's handling of this conflict, and a new poll from the Washington Post and Ipsos found that just 29% approve of the way that Trump has handled this conflict in Iran. And Omar, Trump had this big address just a couple of days ago. It was highlighting election integrity. That was the focus of his speech, but it was going on while all of this escalation was going on there in the region. He barely mentioned it. He did say that he believed the United States was winning big, but he did not go into any detail on the strategy going forward and when all of this could end.
And Julia, as I understand, the State Department is also issuing new guidance to Americans in the region. What can you tell us about that?
They are. The State Department just recently put out a statement urging Americans to use caution as this conflict between the United States and Iran continues. They went on to say this: due to heightened tensions in the Middle East, the security environment remains complex with the potential for unforeseen escalation. The Department of State advises Americans worldwide, and especially in the Middle East, to exercise increased caution. Now, the State Department did issue a similar statement to this back in March.
All right, Julia Benbrook, appreciate the reporting for us there in New Jersey. We're joined now by Democratic Representative Mike Quigley of Illinois. He serves on the House Intelligence and Appropriations Committees. Congressman, really appreciate the time. I just want to start with your reaction to the news that 2 U.S. service members were killed in Jordan and 1 is missing in action.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary tragedy. Our thoughts are with them, their families. As you know, the total is now 16. My reaction is this is a president both desperate and lost. The only way out of this conflict right now seems to be nothing short of a humiliating withdrawal. As the peace proposals seem to show, the U.S. gets nothing out of it. The strait is still closed with lost service members. The inflation is increasing dramatically. The cost will be borne for years, and the regime seems to be emboldened. Israel seems to be in a worse place than it was at the beginning of the war. So, look, the great importance here is that no more service members should be lost or injured, but the president seems to have got himself in a mess and doesn't know how to get out. He had no plan going in, so it shouldn't be a surprise that there doesn't seem to be an exit strategy.
And, you know, when we talk about the total death toll of 16, not all of them have been by direct Iranian fire, but that death toll nonetheless has been one that has climbed over the past few months. And I just wonder, at this point, this is a situation where, as we understand, 2 U.S. troops were killed by direct Iranian fire. Does this now risk escalating the war further, or do you think it is possible to get back to the negotiating table? I just wonder where you see the U.S. going from here.
I mean, they can go back to the negotiating table, and there's always room for negotiating, and that's what we support. But the fact of the matter is, Iran seems to have no reason to negotiate in good faith. They're in a position where they seem to be resilient enough. They have allies that seem to be willing to restock and reload them at this point in time. So I don't have much faith that anything will happen with this, because what was the purpose of this war? Was it regime change? Was it the nuclear program? None of that's going to happen. So at this point in time, the best the president can hope for with negotiations is still something far short of the JCPOA, which he criticized, the Obama peace plan, the nuclear program treaty, in which Iran was in compliance. Now we're at a position where we would be lucky if we got something just short of that deal. So there's always room for negotiating. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of all that, it doesn't seem like the plan for the U.S. will be any sort of net gain. It will be a net loss, an expensive one at that.
Welcome to the CNN Newsroom, everyone. I'm Omar Jimenez in New York. We are following breaking news out of the Middle East, where the United States and Iran's fighting is intensifying. The U.S. military says 2 service members died in an Iranian attack in Jordan yesterday. Another service member is missing in action. These are the first American casualties from Iranian fire since March. And overnight, the United States carried out its 7th consecutive night of attacks against Iran. Meanwhile, Iran is attacking U.S. allies in the Gulf region as well. CNN's Julia Benbrook is with us now from New Jersey, where the president is. Julia, what more are we learning about these service members who were killed?
Well, as you mentioned, President Donald Trump, he is spending his weekend here in New Jersey at one of his nearby properties, and he has not yet publicly released a statement on the 2 service members who were killed. Throughout this conflict, though, we've received a lot of his first reactions during brief phone calls with reporters, and he spoke just a little while ago with News Nation's Hannah Brandt. He told her this. He said that it is a, quote, very sad thing We hate to see it happen. It's in service to our country. He then reiterated what he has said throughout this conflict, that we are not going to allow them to have a nuclear weapon. This comes as there have been days of escalation there in the region. There have been 7 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes, as well as waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. As Central Command confirmed that 2 U.S. service members had been killed in Jordan, they provided a bit more information, saying that on July 17th, 2 U.S. service members in Jordan were killed in action as U.S. Central Command and partner forces defended against Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks. Additionally, 1 service member is currently missing in action. They added that 4 American service members were medically evacuated, sent to Jordanian hospitals, and have since been discharged. Now, they're withholding information on the identities of the 2 service members who were killed until they can be sure that next of kin has been contacted and notified. Now, it was just a little bit over a week ago that as Iran had targeted ships in the Strait, that Trump had said that he believed that the ceasefire was over. And it's been just over a month since there seemed to be this big diplomatic breakthrough, the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding by both the United States and Iran that was supposed to kick off 60 days of technical talks to address some of the big issues like Iran's nuclear program and the fate of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Trump has recently said that he believes that the Memorandum of Understanding is over as well. So what's next here? We do know, according to sources familiar with the matter, that Trump has recently been presented with some options for expanding military action in the Middle East, and that there was a recent meeting in the Situation Room that really centered around what it would take to loosen Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway. Leading up until this, though, Americans have not been approving of what Trump has done in Iran so far. In fact, a recent poll from the Washington Post and Ipsos found that just 29% of Americans approve of the actions that he's taken during this conflict.
And Julia, what do we know about the State Department's new guidance to Americans in the region? What can you tell us there?
Just a couple of hours ago now, the State Department released a new warning telling Americans to use caution as this conflict between the United States and Iran continues. They said specifically that due to heightened tensions in the Middle East, the security environment remains complex with the potential for unforeseen escalation, adding that the Department of State advises Americans worldwide and especially in the Middle East to exercise increased caution. They did issue a similar statement back in March. So they did this a little while ago as well, and re-upping this with this recent news.
All right, Julia Benbrook, really appreciate the reporting. Now let's dig into more of what's happening in the region. I want to bring in CNN's Nick Robertson, who has the latest.
What the Iranians have been saying that they've been targeting in Jordan is a Jordanian airbase just outside the town of Azraq, which is in the desert, not too far from the capital, Amman. Now, this has been an airbase that the Iranians have targeted before because they say it's a base that U.S. forces operate out of, and there has been damage to U.S. military equipment there in the past, going back to the earlier part of the war. We don't know if that's a location where these 2 service members were killed, where the other service member is missing, but that's what Iran said it's been targeting over the past couple of nights. So Jordanians say that last night they'd intercepted at least 10 different missiles and a number of missiles on the previous night as well. Look, what we see Iran doing at the moment is escalating across the region. They haven't targeted Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is at the top of their escalatory ladder after they've targeted all the other Gulf countries. They've targeted the most sensitive site in Saudi Arabia, Yanbu, which is its port facility on the Red Sea, which is where it now exports its oil from because it can't export it through the Strait of Hormuz. So super sensitive, a red line for Saudi Arabia. The Iranians also targeting another airbase, or what appears to be another airbase in Saudi Arabia, Prince Sultan Air Base. That one also typically has been used and was U.S. forces were struck there in the earlier part of the war back in March. So then you look at the bigger picture in Kuwait today. Second day, desalination plant, power plant hit, significant enough for the Kuwaiti minister for electricity and water goes out to visit that plant. Also in Kuwait, an oil, their major oil company there, saying that there was a significant impact on vital equipment. Operatives at that oil plant injured. That part of that plant will be offline for a while. Bahrain hit multiple times. So what we're seeing from Iran is an escalation. Add on top of that what we've heard from their supreme leader today, saying essentially they are not working towards the memorandum of understanding anymore. They don't trust President Trump. They're saying that his signature is worthless and unreliable. And we've heard the same from the deputy foreign minister in Iran, saying they are no longer working to the memorandum of understanding. At this point, it does seem things are set to escalate. And if you want another key indicator of that, the United States has asked Israel here if it can park more and operate more of its KC-135, those air tanker refuelers that are absolutely critical for the F-35s and other fighter jets in the skies as they prosecute the war in the Strait of Hormuz and in Iran. So Israel, again, now attracting more U.S. military hardware in this war at a time when Iran says anyone supporting the U.S. in this region will be targeted. If Israel were to get drawn in, that would be, again, a significant escalation. They've stayed away from it. The Iranians have stayed away from targeting them until now. But this weekend could be a potential turning point.
Nick Robertson, appreciate the reporting. We're joined now by retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Peter Zwack. And General Zwack, I just want to start with your reaction to this news that we've gotten in. The 2 more U.S. service members have been killed in this war and another missing.
Omar, I'm first of all just sad for the families and their friends, but this is war, and as we get, as we're going into a mano a mano phase with the Iranians, we can expect to take more losses. So we need to be steeled for that, and the nation needs to be steeled for that, and yes, this we are in a escalatory cycle, we have the president has not yet spoken on it. The Ayatollah has, this is I think we may be entering into an even more vicious phase than we have hoped for.
So tell me about that. What do you anticipate U.S. retaliation on Iran to look like here?
Yeah, Omar, I think that the retaliation, certainly, we will come in hard with airstrikes. And the question is what? Clearly, we've been now, in a 7-day round, 7-night round, and going after military infrastructure, some civilian infrastructure and bridges and roads and et cetera. But what's next? And we are, of course, we've been listening to concern about desalination plants, power plants, and the one thing we can count on is that the Iranians are not going to bend to us. I think that early on, culturally, we frankly underestimated the Iranians right from the beginning, and the Ayatollah and his current IRGC team have been badly banged up. He's lost much of his family, and they're not going to roll. And we just need to be ready for that. I think that one thing I do worry about with a lot more activity in the air, and we lost the two soldiers and one wounded in Jordan. I'm worried about in the airstrikes that day when we don't get lucky with an aircraft getting shot down, and the airmen parachute into the Gulf or even Iran, and now we have a hostage situation. So I mean, this can go a lot of different ways, and they're angry. Both sides are angry. I don't add our MOU that a lot of fanfare a month ago, and that's gone. The ceasefire is gone, and I think it's going to be more force on force violence, and that is immensely. The only thing we can expect is predictable. Is the unpredictable, and there will be things that happen here, and we just need to be ready and hopefully plan for it.
Breaking news tonight, the United States is announcing new attacks on Iran. I want to bring in Julia Benbrook, who is traveling with the president. She joins us now live from New Jersey. Julia, what do we know here?
Well, a new round of strikes. Things are continuing to escalate. This is coming in a statement from U.S. Central Command. They say that these strikes were carried out at President Donald Trump's direction, and went on to say this: the strikes are designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and swiftly punish Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces who launched attacks against American service members in Jordan last night. Now, this comes after there had already been 7 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes, as well as waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. And the news that 2 U.S. service members had been killed in action in Jordan, and that 1 service member was still missing in action. They had also said that 4 service members had been medically evacuated, sent to Jordanian hospitals, and had been discharged since then. But all of that news, we are still waiting on a direct response to those deaths from Trump. He's spending his weekend here in New Jersey at one of his properties nearby. He did do a brief phone interview with News Nation where he did say that this was very sad, that it was done in service to our country, but he also reiterated a point that he has been making throughout this conflict. He said that Iran will not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. So from that statement, it does seem like this action could continue. And then, of course, there is this confirmation from CENTCOM that more strikes are taking place now. Omar.
Something we are watching very closely right now, all happening in real time. Julia Benbrook, really appreciate the reporting. Now, both the president and the Secretary of Defense have spoken out about the deaths of these 2 American service members killed in Jordan. But when it comes to the overall war, the Pentagon, we haven't seen the press briefings consistently as we have seen in years past. CNN chief media analyst Brian Selter joins us now. So Brian, tell us about this dynamic and how unusual is this for the Pentagon?
This is very unusual when you look at history and past U.S. conflicts. Military beat reporters are increasingly agitated about the complete lack of information, this total information vacuum. Take the announcement just a few minutes ago about these renewed strikes. It comes in the form of a brief statement on X, on a social media platform, with no follow-up and with no access or availability for questioning. The most recent Pentagon press briefing was all the way back on May 5th. So it's been more than 2 months since Pete Hegseth or other senior leaders fielded questions from the press about this ongoing war. Now, if you look back to the war in Iraq or other conflicts involving U.S. personnel, typically there were press briefings almost every day or on a very regular basis, especially in the early weeks and months of a military conflict. In this case, however, the Pentagon's only held a handful of briefings. Those were largely in March and April. And like I said, they've petered out entirely and they stopped in May. It's worth noting now as we go into I believe it's day 8, with U.S. strikes in Iran and with the counter strikes by Iran, that total information vacuum that exists. Hegseth has used X to announce his plan for testosterone checks of troops. He's used X to announce a task force to investigate leakers. He's been using his social media platform to talk about all sorts of things, but he's not taking questions from the press as these strikes inside Iran continue.
Welcome to the CNN Newsroom, everyone. I'm Omar Jimenez in New York. We're going to start with breaking news. The U.S. military says it is launching new airstrikes to swiftly punish Iran after 2 U.S. service members were killed in an Iranian attack in Jordan yesterday. Another U.S. service member is missing in action after yesterday's attack. The 2 troops are the first to be killed from Iranian fire in several months since March. And this all comes as fighting between the United States and Iran is intensifying. Tehran says it is suspending its commitments to its initial agreement with Washington. And then over the past 7 days, the United States has conducted strikes against Iran, while Iran has bombarded U.S. allies in the Gulf region. CNN's Julia Benbrook joins us now from New Jersey, where the president is. And Julia, what more are we learning about this latest wave of attacks?
Well, a new wave of attacks from the United States have been confirmed by U.S. Central Command. They say that these started at the direction of President Donald Trump just about an hour ago, 6 p.m. Eastern, and went on to say in a statement the strikes are designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and swiftly punish Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces who launched attacks against American service members in Jordan last night. This comes after there had already been 7 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes, as well as waves of Iranian drone and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. And the confirmation that 2 U.S. service members in Jordan had been killed in action. 1 other service member is still missing. Now, CENTCOM also said that 4 American service members were medically evacuated from that area and sent to Jordanian hospitals. They have since been discharged. There isn't a lot of information about the 2 U.S. service members who were killed at this point while they are working to notify next of kin. But it was just about a week ago, Omar, that things really started to escalate again, as Iran had targeted some of the ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump had said that he believed that the ceasefire was over. And then just about a month ago, there was hope that there was going to be this big diplomatic breakthrough. The Memorandum of Understanding was signed by both the United States and Iran. It was kicking off a 60-day time period to have technical talks on the big issues, like Iran's nuclear program, which includes the fate of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Trump has recently said, though, that in his opinion, that Memorandum of Understanding is also, quote, over. So what happens next here? There are a lot of questions, but sources familiar with the matter say that Trump has been presented with options for expanding military operations in Iran. That was before those 2 service members were killed, and that there was a Situation Room meeting just a few days ago that centered around how to loosen Iran's grip over the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway. And Trump did give a major address a couple of days ago. It was focused on election integrity, but it was taking place while all of this escalation was going on there in Iran. And he barely mentioned this conflict. He simply said that he believed that the United States was winning this conflict. When it comes to how Americans are seeing this, overall, they've been skeptical of how Trump has handled things there, with just 29% in a recent poll by the Washington Post and Ipsos, just 29% saying that they approve of how Trump has handled this conflict.
And something, obviously, we are watching minute by minute right now as Central Command has been putting out updates. Julia Benbrook, really appreciate the reporting there for us in New Jersey. I want to bring in former State Department Middle East negotiator Aaron David Miller. He's also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Aaron, what is your assessment of where we are tonight in this war as we have new attacks underway right now?
Thanks for having me, Omar. Look, we were already in an escalatory cycle here because it can't break the current impasse. The Iranians have demonstrated their weaponized geography. They're going to want to hold on to the straits. The administration is determined. Forget about proxies, ballistic missiles, or Iran's nuclear program. The issue now is how to reopen them. So you have an impasse. And I say this in all sincerity. I think the situation is going to get worse before it gets worse. The Iranian regime clearly has the capacity to target American military bases. The Muwafaq Salti Air Base is a critically important piece of the regional hub where the U.S. operates in and out of, and because of the vulnerability of the Gulf bases, they may have moved some personnel to Muwaffaq Salti. So they've demonstrated that essentially they can continue to hit not Quad Jordan, but the Jordanian air base in which the U.S. stages out. And the president has made it unmistakably clear. I'm sort of surprised the reaction on the ground hasn't been more expansive. He has basically said repeatedly that if Americans are killed, there will be an overwhelming response. So far, the administration has confined their responses today to IRGC command and control drone and missile infrastructure. So we'll see in hours and days ahead whether those strikes are expanded. But the bottom line here, Omar, is there's no way out of this. Force is not going to change Iran's calculation. And the administration is going to have a hard time acquiescing to the new reality of Iran's control and leverage over the Straits.
You know, you look back a month ago or so when the posturing did seem to be a little bit more optimistic in terms of, you had a memorandum of understanding. It seemed that despite tit-for-tat strikes and flare-ups, that there was going to be a diplomatic process moving forward. When there are negotiations happening behind the scenes and you inevitably have flare-ups militarily, what happens to those negotiations? Do those lines of communication stay open with the understanding that, hey, we're not going to be able to move forward until this military part plays out? Or just what is happening diplomatically behind the scenes now?
Look, I voted and worked for Republicans and Democrats. And let me say very clearly, even when negotiations were happening, they were largely performative. The MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, has turned into the Memorandum of Misunderstanding. I don't know who was doing the lawyering and negotiating on our side, but they clearly produced a highly flawed document which gave the Iranians in Article 5 the talking points to continue to insist that they and the Omanis will administer the Straits. So I think you can't do these negotiations on the back of a cocktail napkin. You can't do them on a cell phone. You can't do them through intermediaries, the Qataris, the Pakistanis, however well-intentioned. There's no trust and confidence between the Trump administration and the Islamic Republic. And unless you get to a point to buy the time and space to have serious negotiations and do serious diplomacy, assuming the Iranians want to engage, we're going to drift. And if we were only drifting, that would be one thing, but we're escalating. And once that escalatory cycle gets out of control, no amount of back channel contacts is going to end it. Right now, this, for the time being, Omar, is the new normal.
And just for a moment, I want to look at the location where these service members were unfortunately killed, as we understand, in Jordan. What is the significance of Jordan in terms of the United States and to this region?
I mean, the Jordanians, the Hashemites, have been a partner, economic, political, security partner for the United States, stretching back to the early 50s. There's an intelligence relationship with Jordanian intelligence and the agency. The late King Hussein and even the current King Abdullah, I think, are moderate monarchs. Yes, Jordan is an authoritarian country. Nonetheless, the Jordanians have facilitated American policy and, on balance, been a reliable ally. But they are now a point of vulnerability. And if, in fact, the administration, CENTCOM, is moving personnel from Gulf states to Muwaffaq Salti, this base named after a Jordanian lieutenant who was killed in 1966. It's a Jordanian Royal Air Force base. Nonetheless, the U.S. has turned it into a key hub of operation for advanced fighter aircraft. The Iranian message is, we can strike you wherever, and we can and will continue to strike the U.S. military bases where we can find them. They've already done far more damage, I think, than the administration is willing to admit in a number of bases in the Gulf. So, again, what we don't want to see happen is to push this into a regional war. And the Israelis are not involved right now, but if this goes on and the Iranians choose to motivate Hezbollah to strike Israel proper, the Israelis will get involved. And then it's going to be very hard to put this to bed anytime soon.
Let's begin in the Middle East, where U.S. Central Command says it has completed the 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. Earlier, Iranian state media reported several explosions across the port city of Bandar Abbas and an Iranian island in the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian official says at least 50 people have now been killed in the past 3 weeks. CENTCOM says the latest strikes were carried out in retaliation for Iranian strikes that killed 2 U.S. service members in Jordan. A new statement, allegedly from Iran's supreme leader, has been broadcast on Iranian state media. Mojtaba Khamenei has yet to appear in public since the start of the war. He said, in part, quote, "The signature of the President of the United States is utterly worthless and invalid, and that bullying, hegemonic ambition, and savagery are inseparable components of the American creed and way of conduct." Well, Tehran says it's suspending its commitments under the deal reached with Washington last month as it hits targets in the Gulf, including an oil facility in Kuwait. CNN's Julia Benbrook has more for us.
This comes after there had already been days of escalation. For 7 consecutive nights, the U.S. carried out strikes, and there were waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. It also comes after CENTCOM said that 2 U.S. service members had been killed in action in Jordan and that 1 service member was still missing. They also said that 4 American service members were medically evacuated and taken to Jordanian hospitals. They have since been discharged. They are withholding some information at this time as they are working to notify next of kin. Now, this comes just about a week after Iran had targeted ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump said that he believed that the ceasefire was over. It also comes about a month after there was hope for this diplomatic breakthrough. Both the United States and Iran had signed the Memorandum of Understanding to kick off a 60-day time period for more technical talks. Recently, though, Trump has said that, in his opinion, the Memorandum of Understanding is, quote, over as well. So what's next here? We do know, according to sources familiar with the matter, that Trump has been presented with options for expanding military operations in Iran. That came before the news that these 2 service members had been killed, and that there was a Situation Room meeting that centered around how to loosen Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway. As far as how Americans are responding, a recent Washington Post Ipsos poll found that just 29% approve of how Trump has handled the conflict in Iran. Traveling with the president in New Jersey, Julia Benbrook, CNN.
Let's begin in the Middle East, where U.S. Central Command says it's completed the 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. Earlier, Iranian state media reported several explosions across the port city of Bandar Abbas and an Iranian island in the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian official says at least 50 people have now been killed in the past 3 weeks. CENTCOM says the latest strikes were carried out in retaliation for Iranian strikes that killed 2 U.S. service members in Jordan. CNN's Julia Benbrook has more for us.
This comes after there had already been days of escalation. For 7 consecutive nights, the U.S. carried out strikes, and there were waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. It also comes after CENTCOM said that 2 U.S. service members had been killed in action in Jordan and that 1 service member was still missing. They also said that 4 American service members were medically evacuated and taken to Jordanian hospitals. They have since been discharged. They are withholding some information at this time as they are working to notify next of kin. Now, this comes just about a week after Iran had targeted ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump said that he believed that the ceasefire was over. It also comes about a month after there was hope for this diplomatic breakthrough. Both the United States and Iran had signed the Memorandum of Understanding to kick off a 60-day time period for more technical talks. Recently, though, Trump has said that, in his opinion, the Memorandum of Understanding is, quote, over as well. So what's next here? We do know, according to sources familiar with the matter, that Trump has been presented with options for expanding military operations in Iran. That came before the news that these two service members had been killed, and that there was a Situation Room meeting that centered around how to loosen Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway. As far as how Americans are responding, a recent Washington Post Ipsos poll found that just 29% approve of how Trump has handled the conflict in Iran. Traveling with the president in New Jersey, Julia Benbrook, CNN.
All right, joining us live from Berlin is Ali Fatullah-Najad. He's the founder and director of the Center for Middle East and Global Order. It's good to see you, sir. With those U.S. service members being killed, how much do you think their deaths could now change America's objectives in this conflict?
Well, as we know from American history, the casualties of U.S. soldiers are always a heavy political cost for the administration. And so far during the war with Iran, we've seen about 16 soldiers being killed. The Iranian side also knows about the importance of such casualties. It has been widely portrayed in Iranian state TV that in Jordan, this has led to casualties. Iranian attacks have led to casualties. But then we can see much more escalation on that front when it comes to potential casualties if the U.S. goes along with potential plans to act as a kind of military guardian of the Strait, which would involve a sustained months-long military campaign involving the control, if not occupation, of the Strait of Hormuz adjacent southern coast of Iran, and also Iranian islands. So this would potentially lead to much more U.S. casualties, in fact, yeah.
The U.S. has now carried out an 8th night of strikes. Are we now looking at a sustained military campaign against Iran?
Well, it seems that the United States' aim is to block or cripple Iran's ability to disrupt this crucial waterway. Iran has resumed attacks on international shipping in the Strait of Hormuz from late June, since late June. And it's clear that the U.S. military campaign is meant to cripple Iran's military infrastructure near the straits, including key logistics hubs along the southern coast of Iran, but also the south-north corridor, damaging key bridges and railroads. So this is what the U.S. campaign probably is meant to do, increasing the pressure on the Islamic Republic to stop its disruption. But I fear that this strategy, also if we go into a military scenario that I explained earlier, is probably not, is difficult to be successful at the end of the day, because it's very extremely difficult to militarily, open up the Strait of Hormuz for the reasons already stated.
At the same time as that, Iran has targeted U.S. allies across the region. Do you think that Tehran is deliberately trying to widen this conflict?
Well, it's very clear that Iran's response has been like during the March war. It has retaliated not against, primarily against the United States, but primarily against the Arab Gulf states, not only against the U.S. military facilities there, but also civilian infrastructure, with the aim to push those Arab Gulf states that they increase their pressure upon the Trump administration so that the U.S. Stops the war. But this is also unlikely to, bring the fruition of this aim. Iran is acting on the infrastructure versus infrastructure model, which carries a lot of risks, obviously, for the GCC. But maybe the broader point is that there is, first of all, the Iranian ambition to control the strait, but there is also a kind of regime with more hardline elements that are pushing for this kind of control of the Strait of Hormuz by all means necessary. They also favor war more than peace, because in peacetime, they would fear that they're going to see a reemergence of a popular upheaval against Islamic Republic by the Iranian people, given that the structural crises of the country are still very, very deep and there are no policy answers from the government to those crises. Plus the fact that this hardline camp that seems to be dominating Iran's course of action right now is very much critical vis-a-vis, the other camp within the regime, the hardline pragmatists, who are leading the negotiations. So this is about jealousy of political standing. But it's also about the redistribution of power in post-Ali Khamenei Iran and the respective political and economic weight of those two factions. So this kind of regional regime in fighting in Tehran is complicating the picture and also the future of the conflict.
We've got about 30 seconds left, but looking at the next 24 hours as things keep changing so quickly, what do you think is the biggest risk of this conflict escalating further?
Well, the biggest risk is that, within this infrastructure versus infrastructure model, much more civilian infrastructure going to be affected on both sides of the Gulf, in Iran, but also in the GCC, that going to have very negative consequences for the populations of both sides. So this is the very heavy risk. And when it comes to the Iranian side, the Islamic Republic has not proven to be careful about what the impact on its own civilians going to be from any kind of war and confrontation.
Okay, Ali Fatullah-Najad, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
We begin in the Middle East, where the U.S. military just announced it has completed the 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. Earlier, Iranian state media reported several explosions across the port city of Bandar Abbas in an Iranian island in the Strait of Hormuz. An Iranian official says at least 50 people have now been killed in the past 3 weeks. U.S. Central Command says the latest strikes were carried out in retaliation for Iranian strikes that killed 2 U.S. service members in Jordan. Iranian state media has broadcast the latest written statement, purportedly from the supreme leader, who has yet to appear in public since the start of the war. It says in part, quote, "The signature of the President of the United States is utterly worthless and invalid, and that bullying, hegemonic ambition, and savagery are inseparable components of the American creed and way of conduct." A senior Iranian officer says war will escalate to full-scale offensive operations if U.S. strikes continue. Iran has been hitting targets in the Gulf, including an oil facility in Kuwait. CNN's Julia Benbrook has more.
This comes after there had already been days of escalation. For 7 consecutive nights, the U.S. carried out strikes, and there were waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. It also comes after CENTCOM said that 2 U.S. service members had been killed in action in Jordan and that 1 service member was still missing. They also said that 4 American service members were medically evacuated and taken to Jordanian hospitals. They have since been discharged. They are withholding some information at this time as they are working to notify next of kin. Now, this comes just about a week after Iran had targeted ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump said that he believed that the ceasefire was over. It also comes about a month after there was hope for this diplomatic breakthrough. Both the United States and Iran had signed the Memorandum of Understanding to kick off a 60-day time period for more technical talks. Recently, though, Trump has said that, in his opinion, the Memorandum of Understanding is, quote, over as well. So,
U.S. and Iran inching closer to an all-out regional war. Concerns are growing. The conflict may be entering a dangerous new phase, one that can't be easily contained. Both sides carried out a 9th straight night of escalatory strikes, and they are expanding their attack targets, including civilian infrastructure relied on by millions of people. It comes as the Pentagon reveals the identities of 2 soldiers killed during Iranian strikes in Jordan on Friday. Those repeated attacks on the more distant regional U.S. allies, perhaps proving Iran still maintains offensive capabilities despite months of American strikes. Meantime, on Sunday, we learned of another American soldier that had been killed, this time in northern Iraq. We're also learning additional American firepower is headed to the region as well. CNN's Kevin Liptak joins us live now from the White House. I think it's fair to say that this administration really underestimated the resilience of Iran and their sort of staying power through this war. Just walk us through that. Why was this a nation that was so underestimated back on February 28th?
Well, I think President Trump was convinced by advisors as well as the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel that perhaps this war would be much more decisive than it was as it has turned out to be. You know, I think the president thought, as his own video the day the war began suggested, that the Iranian regime would fall relatively quickly, that the U.S. would be able to seriously degrade the missile and drone capabilities, including along the Strait of Hormuz. But the thing that they didn't seem to factor in was that Iran would close the strait and view it as leverage going forward. And you have seen ever since the war move away from its original strategic objectives, which was to degrade Iran's nuclear ambitions, and move much more towards the strait and trying to reopen it. And now you see, as the president considers widening the conflict again, that remains the area of focus. And you've seen the Central Command over the last 9 nights go after facilities along the strait to try and wear down Iran's ability to launch those missiles and drones towards not only commercial vessels in the strait, but also towards American military installations in the region. And you're right, I think it's just clearly a lack of awareness of what Iran might be willing to do in order to wait the U.S. out in terms of the conflict. And the president's own plans for how long this would take, he originally said it would be maximum 6 weeks, and now we're well past the 4-month mark. And the deaths of these Americans will provide, I think, another moment for the president to consider what he's going to do now. You know, it does seem to suggest, based on where these attacks happened, that Iran not only retains its missile and drone capabilities, but also seems more able to evade American anti-missile defenses than it was earlier on in the conflict, suggesting that they have used the 4 months of war to learn about how the United States is trying to defend its installations in the region. Now, the U.S. at this point does seem like it's preparing for something more escalatory. I'm told that F-16 and F-35 fighter jets from bases in Europe are now heading to the region, along with aerial refueling tankers, which I think gives an indication that the president is preparing for some sort of wider option. But at the same time, you hear the diplomats involved in all of this suggest that there could be still the opportunity to resolve this around the negotiating table. The Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the U.S. is getting indications from Iran that it wants to get back to negotiations, although at this point it's hard to detect exactly where those discussions actually are.
Time might exacerbate the situation by disrupting the global oil supply even further. The Iranian-backed group has declared a maritime blockade on Saudi shipping, putting Riyadh's crude exports at risk. The U.S. war with Iran, meantime, may be taking a dangerous new turn as more American firepower is headed to the region. Washington and Tehran engaged in a 9th night of consecutive escalatory strikes, with the U.S. expanding its attacks inside of Iran, and civilian infrastructure is increasingly becoming a target for both sides. In his latest CNN analysis, Stephen Collinson writes, the new U.S. escalation in Iran makes Trump's endgame vacuum more urgent. CNN's Stephen Collinson joins us live now from Washington. So Stephen, there are some countries in a war where you can continue sort of bombarding them militarily, and eventually they will surrender and capitulate. Iran is obviously not one of those countries. And part of the region, there's several factors to that. Part of it is the sort of asymmetrical nature of their ability to retaliate. They retaliate against Gulf nations. They also have control over the Strait of Hormuz. And on top of that, their leadership, their sort of political leadership, is built for survival. There's also an ideological element to this as well, where just the very nature, or the very idea of capitulating goes against everything this leadership in Iran, the sort of systems that they've put in place, stands for. So President Trump and the administration here obviously knows this. So the idea of thinking that something's going to be different this time just because they continue bombing for 9 consecutive days and they're sending more firepower to the region, why do they think that's going to make a difference this time?
It's a good point. And if you put everything you just said about Iran against the fact that Trump sees things in life, in business, and in politics in a rather binary fashion, you're either winning or you're losing, you have the ingredients for the current stalemate that we're at. If you look at his interactions with Iran over the last year or so during his second term, the initial negotiations on the nuclear program before the raids last year on Iranian nuclear sites, then again earlier this year before the war, and now after the memorandum of understanding has collapsed, it seems like Trump believes that by increasing military force, he can improve the US negotiating position. The problem with that is it repeatedly seems to be the case that it doesn't work. He got what he declared was one of the greatest deals in the history of the Middle East in the memorandum of understanding, and it collapsed within a few days. But all through this conflict, it doesn't seem that the administration has had a very strong sense of history of exactly what motivates the Iranians. The memorandum of understanding was, after all, based on the idea that runs through the Trump foreign policies that at some point everybody can be bought off with financial riches. And as you say, there are ideological and historical and political reasons why that clearly isn't the case with Iran. The administration doesn't seem to be seeing that. And I think the question is now is how long Trump sticks with this escalation, having failed to explain to Americans and the rest of the world why this tactic of aerial bombardment will be any more successful than it was in the earlier stages of this war.
And just in terms of, I think there are key lessons that the Americans are going to walk away from this war with when it eventually ends. I mean, at the beginning, I was speaking to Kevin Liptek about this. At the beginning of this war on February 28th, they clearly underestimated Iran's sort of staying power, just the sheer level of resilience. This is a country that has a different level of tolerance for casualties, different level of tolerance for, widespread destruction in their country. And so when this war is said and done, and obviously President Trump has talked about how difficult, from his perspective, the Iranians are to negotiate with. Obviously, the Iranians would say the same thing, of course, about the Americans. But when this war is said and done, what do you think is going to be the biggest takeaway for the Americans? What would be the biggest lesson that they, I guess, should have learned?
Well, it would seem to be the same lesson of Vietnam, of Afghanistan, of Iraq, is that what the assumptions are about an adversary in Washington, their staying power, their motivations, their political desires are often completely out of step with what the force on the ground, which the opposing government, actually the characteristics of that opposing government. That seems to be a lesson that was pretty well drummed into Washington with the failure of the Iraq and Afghan wars, which only, let's face it, ended a few years ago after massive, long military engagements. Trump has seemed to believe that he can get around all that by a vigorous aerial bombardment without ground troops, without being sucked into a quagmire. But that has failed here. I think ultimately, politically, the way this will probably shape out, as it often does, is in more isolationism in the United States, more concern by American voters about getting sucked into foreign wars, which is rather ironic since that was at the center of Trump's platform in 2016 and even in 2020. And that's still something, that reticence about foreign adventures that sits very deeply, I think, in the American political DNA in the 21st century. Yet at the same time, there is this constant temptation for presidents to demonstrate power and to try to implement what they see as U.S. interests by the use of force. They're constantly being dragged into conflict.
President Trump is weighing his options for what comes next in Iran as the human cost of this war increases with each passing week. The Pentagon identified 2 American soldiers killed in Jordan on Friday. Another soldier was killed in northern Iraq over the weekend. Trump called their deaths a shame and then had this to say.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots are out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Jordan, meantime, is coming under increasing fire. Attacks on the regional U.S. ally, which is further away from Tehran than the Gulf nations, is perhaps proof that Iran still maintains offensive capabilities despite months of American attacks. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us live now from Jerusalem. I think that the resilience and the sheer sort of staying power is something that may have caught the Americans off guard when they started this war back at the end of February. Just walk us through what a diplomatic off-ramp, though, at this point in time looks like, Nick.
It looks very difficult, and it's hard to see. At the moment, there is the Iranian Interior Minister meeting with his Pakistani counterpart, who's one of the main mediators between the US and Iran. It's not clear what they're going to talk about, whether or not they can push forward the opportunity for an off-ramp. It just doesn't seem to be there. The information that we get that the United States is bringing in more F-35 fighter jets, more F-16 fighter jets, more KC-135 Stratotanker refuelers for those fighter jets is an indication that this war is going to continue, and it may continue at a bigger pace. There's the real risk of overspill. The tensions between the Houthis, who are widely seen as a proxy for Iran, and Saudi Arabia are sort of reaching an all-time high at the moment because of the Houthis' apparent intention, potential intention to shut down the Red Sea as a means of getting oil, Saudi oil, out of the Gulf region and to international markets. So the tensions are rising there as well. The picture that's being painted here, and you raised it there, of the capabilities that Iran has to continue the war, and it's demonstrated that this past week in Jordan, particularly hitting, it claims, a number of air bases, it claims destroying a number of aircraft, and as we know, killing at least two United States service personnel there. It demonstrates not just that they have obviously the capability and the intent, but one of the things that they have that's become very important is the real-time satellite intelligence, very precise, optically very, very clear, giving them a very clear image of what they're trying to hit on the ground. And the message to the United States is, you might be able to move your aircraft around or bring additional aircraft in, but we can still target them. And the message, obviously, to the Gulf states of Kuwait and Bahrain, which have been taking a huge amount of attacks. Kuwait, again, for the second time today, air raid sirens going off again there in the past few hours, is seeing a significant amount of infrastructure damage. It's not clear what, if is being hit in Bahrain or if it's all being intercepted, but that's certainly coming in for multiple strikes each day. So the diplomatic off-ramp in that context, even though you have the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman and the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying they're open to discussions, the channels are there, they're also both saying that the memorandum of understanding that was the diplomatic off-ramp, that's on the sidelines. It's not being used. So it's very hard to see where this finds an exit from the military essential escalation at the moment.
States launching attacks on Iran for a 9th straight day, as a 3rd U.S. service member is confirmed killed since Friday. 2 service members died in an Iranian attack on an air base in Jordan, while a 3rd died in Iraq. 1 service member is still missing in action. Iran is also continuing its attacks, including this one in Kuwait. It has now struck 7 countries, Arab Gulf nations in the region. With the U.S. Now joining us now is Ambassador Dennis Ross. He was a special assistant to President Obama on the Middle East peace process and is a counselor over at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis, thanks so much for joining us. Do you expect there will be larger fallout from the deaths of these U.S. service members? Is this war with Iran now going to dramatically escalate?
I don't know that it's going to dramatically escalate, although it's clear the U.S. is moving F-15s and F-35s to the region, is also moving additional aerial refueling tankers. So that suggests we're probably going to increase the scope and intensity of the attacks we're going to carry out. The Iranians, as you just noted, have hit 7 different states in the region. So there is a dynamic here that seems to be an escalatory one, but it's also noteworthy that A, the Iranians are not hitting Israel, which suggests they know that Israel would hit back in a big way. B, the United States is still not hitting certain kinds of targets, meaning we're not hitting power plants, we're not going after energy facilities. And I think the reason for that is we're seeing that the Iranians have the ability to hit similar kinds of targets in the Gulf states. I think when they hit Kuwait and they hit the desalination plant, an electricity-related facility, an oil-related facility, that was their way of signaling, if you hit these kinds of targets within Iran, we will hit those kinds of targets in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and elsewhere, and the impact on oil prices will be dramatic. So I think there is still a conflict that is being fought within certain bounds. Wolf, the basic problem is there's no way out of the current impasse because the Iranians are insisting they will control the straits, and we're saying they will not.
The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says the U.S. is still open to diplomacy with Iran. Iranian officials say they were also open to it. But how does diplomacy even restart at this point with this war escalating?
Well, it's not unusual to have force and diplomacy operate at the same time. Oftentimes, each side is using force to try to affect the terms of a negotiation. I think that's what we're seeing at this point. I think both sides actually would like to find a way out. Our reimposition of the blockade has dramatically damaged further an already desperate economy within Iran. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard leadership, may speak strongly and boldly about how that's not going to affect them, but the truth is it does have an effect on them. But the same is true here. The president is clearly sensitive to the idea of oil prices going dramatically higher. Each side would like to find a way out, but neither side wants to look like it's backing down. It's in that context that you have mediators like the Qataris offering new proposals that start with a 10-day ceasefire, and then you come up with what might be some new mechanisms that involve many of the states in the region as part of the management of the straits. Each side is going to need some way out. The one thing from an American standpoint that I think is essential, Iran cannot be in control of the Straits of Hormuz when all this ends. Let's recall, Wolf, that on February 27th, the straits were open. Supposedly, our main objective was about preventing Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon, but our whole focus right now seems to be on reopening the straits, which, by the way, were open prior to the war.
How deep, Dennis, are the fractures within Iran's regime right now? We still haven't seen, as you know, the new supreme leader. He was injured. His father was killed in the opening days of the war. Are we even sure who is in charge right now?
Historically, I would just note that we've always seen factions within the Iranian elite. That's not new. But the supreme leader was always the arbiter and always the decision maker. Right now, we don't know what the real status of the supreme leader is. He hasn't been seen. Statements are issued. They're probably written by others. I think what we're seeing is a kind of balance of power where maybe the supreme leader has some role, but there's probably a balance of power where the dominant voice at this point is really reflecting the Revolutionary Guard. But I do think the president, Pezeshkian, the Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, I think they are part of the decision-making process, it still seems that the Revolutionary Guard has greater sway. But again, there's a kind of balance of power at this point, favoring one side a little bit more. The longer this goes on, the greater the pressures from within, given what's happening to the economy. I still think we'll see an interest on their part to find a way out. The problem is they think they can outlast President Trump. And that's really, I think, why we're seeing the dynamic we are right now.
As you know, Israel says it will respond and respond militarily to any future attack from Iran or its proxies for that matter. What does Israel want right now? How do you see it?
Well, I think there's what the prime minister wants in terms of the politics of the situation. And I think he would still like to be able to inflict much more damage on the Iranian ballistic missile capability, its inventories, and the like. But he's not in a position to make decisions. It's the president of the United States who's making the decisions. And I think the president at this point doesn't seem to want the Israelis to be involved. It's ironic that the Iranians don't seem to want the Israelis to be involved. The only way the Israelis become involved is if the president changes his mind and or the Iranians hit Israel. At this point, they're avoiding that. So I still think, even though within Israel, I think there's a strong sense that something could happen this week where Israel is drawn in, my sense at this point is that basically neither the United States nor the Iranians seem to want the Israelis involved, because I still think there's a desire, at least on the part of the president, to keep this more limited. I think we're going to see him try to strike a balance where he's going to do much more this week in the hopes that by hitting the Iranians even harder with the blockade, they will come around and look for a way out. Now, whether we can get to that point right now, given the kind of zero-sum quality of each side wanting an outcome that the other can't really live with, that remains to be seen. But I still think we're seeing each side operate within certain limits. And the mediators may come up with something as things begin to look worse that allows each side to take a step back. That, I think, is the hope for the moment.
News we're following. CNN has learned that the United States is now sending more fighter aircraft to the Middle East as fighting clearly escalates in the war with Iran. A U.S. official tells CNN that fighter jets and aerial refueling tankers will be pulled from bases in Europe. Meanwhile, a third U.S. service member has been confirmed killed, and it happened Sunday in northern Iraq while they were trying to detonate a downed Iranian attack drone. 2 other service members were killed Friday in an Iranian attack on an airbase in Jordan, and another service member is still missing in action. The total number of U.S. troop fatalities in this war has now climbed to 17.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots are out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily.
But Iran is clearly proving it can still hit back, expanding its strikes to 7 Gulf Arab countries across the region. Here you see smoke rising from an oil facility in Kuwait after repeated attacks. Let's go live right now to CNN senior White House correspondent Kristen Holmes. Kristen, what are you learning this morning? What else is going on?
Well, Wolf, we're clearly seeing a lot of escalating tension, a lot of escalating back and forth between the U.S. and Iran. And sources say President Trump is considering all of his options, including widening the war against Iran. As you noted, this will involve, while he weighs those options, the U.S. sending over more aircrafts to the Middle East. That includes F-16s, F-32s, and those refueling aerial tankers. Now, we've seen back and forth here that has, as we've noted, really gone after more targets and seemingly put negotiations into a rearview mirror. We saw Central Command saying that it finished up its 9th day of these consecutive strikes in Iran, and that's not stopping U.S. diplomats and negotiators from saying that there's still a diplomatic approach on the table. This is the Secretary of State Marco Rubio talking about that.
You can't have an MOU that's alive if they're violating the terms of it. What I will say is that the United States always remains open to a diplomatic solution. We've tried multiple times with Iran, and we'll continue to try. If that door opens, we'll be happy to see it open. They continue to send signals that they want to talk, that they want to negotiate, but their behavior is what we're responding to. And their behavior is they're launching missiles and drones against ships, including tonight.
And now we're seeing both sides really escalating their attacks on sensitive civilian infrastructure. And I do want to talk quickly about those U.S. troops killed. I know you walked through them. We know in northern Iraq there was one service member killed and another wounded. In Jordan, 2 U.S. troops killed in action, 1 service member missing in action. There have been remains that were found but not yet identified. And this is also raising a lot of alarm bells as to whether or not Iran is figuring out how to get around the U.S. air defenses. Remember, one of the big sticking points for so many Americans and even Republicans who support President Trump was not losing more U.S. troops. Obviously, we've had one of the most deadly stretches here in the last few days that we've seen really since early on in the war.
All right, Kristen Holmes at the White House for us. Thank you very much. Also this morning, the Defense Department identified the 2 U.S. service members killed in Jordan. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan was from Eva Beach in Hawaii. He was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. First Lieutenant Feehan was 25 years old. And Private Isabella Gonzalez was from Carrollton, Texas. She was stationed in Ansbach, Germany. Private Gonzalez was just 19 years old. My deepest condolences to their families. May they rest in peace and may their memories be a blessing. And joining us here in the Situation Room, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. He's a CNN military analyst. Colonel Leighton, what do we know about the air base, first of all, in Jordan, where these 2 American service members were killed and another now is still missing? We should note that this service member has not yet been found.
Yeah, that's right, Wolf, and of course our condolences to the families of these service members. One of the things that we have to note about this base is the Mufawaq al-Salti base, and it's in about 100 kilometers northeast of Amman, Jordan, the capital, and it's been a base that's been used in the past by the U.S. For various operations, including operations in Iraq when we were conducting the shock and awe phase of Iraq freedom. This base has been, set aside. Parts of it have been set aside for us by the Jordanians, and it includes right now a whole string of different types of aircraft, including fighter jets like F-35 fighter jets. I believe there are also F-16s there at this point in time. There also are drones there. The MQ-9 Reaper is stationed at Mufawaq al-Salti, and then of course the tankers, the KC-135 tankers. Some of them are stationed there. Of course, there are others that are coming into Israel at this point in time, but Mufawaq al-Salti is a real big node for the U.S. military, both from an Air Force and naval air perspective, as well as from an Army perspective. So it's a large node for CENTCOM to operate in this part of the Middle East.
And the Iranians are clearly targeting these Gulf Arab nations that normally are not involved in a war with Iran, but they're targeting countries like Iran, Bahrain, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. These countries are very significant countries in the region, and they're going after them, even infrastructure targets where no U.S. troops are involved.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And the way the Iranians are targeting it, they seem to start, in some respects, with U.S. military bases. 6 service members at the beginning of it is the Iranians are also going after those civilian infrastructure targets that you mentioned. Those include desalination plants, so those include airports, and of course, anybody who's flown in and around the Middle East knows that airlines like Emirates and Qatar Airways, those nodes and hubs that they have in those areas are critically important for those airlines, because those airlines have become global players in the aviation industry, and it's a huge impact also on the tourism and on business in general.
And they attacked that commercial airport in Aqaba, the southernmost port of Jordan.
That's right. And Jordan is actually really, not only the base that's north of Aqaba, but Aqaba in that southwestern corner of Jordan touches, actually called the Gulf of Aqaba, touches on the Red Sea. And what that indicates is that the Iranians are not only hitting those areas in Jordan, but they're also sending a signal to Israel, because Eilat, the port city in Israel,
it's right next to Aqaba.
Exactly, is right next to Aqaba. Aqaba, and that also means that it's not that far from those two cities to the Suez Canal. So what the Iranians are signaling is that there is a potential that they will want to shut down the Red Sea transit routes in addition to the Persian Gulf transit routes. So if the Iranians do that, then we've got even more of a mess on our hands, because those two areas are major transit hubs for global trade, not just the oil trade, but basically all goods that are used in international trade become through one of those areas.
But if those Iranian drone and missile strikes go further than Jordan and hit Israel, the Israelis will respond overwhelmingly.
They certainly will, and the Israelis have made that pretty clear. Defense Minister Katz has mentioned it, and obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu has said things about that in the past as well. The Israelis, of course, are going to exercise their right of self-defense, and then we have a situation where we've got basically the U.S. and Israel on one side and Iran on the other, and the Arab states caught more or less in the middle, both geographically as well as otherwise, and that will become a significant issue for all of them at this point.
Very significant. CNN is learning that the U.S. is planning to send additional F-16 fighter jets, F-35 fighter jets, along with more aerial refueling tankers to the Middle East as these tensions clearly soar. This is pretty significant right now.
It is, and when you look at what we already have in the Gulf region, you've got, of course, carrier strike groups that are in the Arabian Sea, near the Persian Gulf. You've got the aircraft that are already based in areas of the Middle East, including Jordan and Saudi Arabia, as well as United Arab Emirates and Qatar. So those areas are going to get beefed up, basically. The airplanes that you mentioned, the fighters, as well as the aerial refueling tankers, are also probably going to be augmented by other aircraft such as reconnaissance aircraft and other drones potentially as well. And if all of that moves forward, they'll be coming from Europe, and that will basically set the stage for even further military offensives and basically a military campaign against Iran, one that is even more extensive than what we've seen so far.
Right now, more U.S. fighter jets are headed to the Mideast as President Trump weighs widening the war he began 5 months ago. That's after a dramatic ratcheting up of hostilities over the past few days and the deaths of 3 U.S. service members, the first troops killed in action since March. This morning, the Pentagon identified 2 of the fallen as 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan of Hawaii and 19-year-old Private Isabella Gonzalez of Texas. They were killed in Jordan during an Iranian attack. A third, still unidentified service member died on Saturday in northern Iraq. CNN's Kevin Liptak is at the White House. Kevin, what are you hearing from your sources about where they think this is going to go at this time?
Yeah, and I think you heard from the president himself yesterday, vowing retribution for these Americans' death. And I think behind the scenes, the president has been receiving options from advisors about a potential widening of this conflict, including in the Situation Room last week. And you do see how the United States is now preparing the ground for that potential widening. I'm told by a U.S. official that the U.S. is sending additional aircraft to the region, including F-16 and F-35 fighter jets that are coming from bases in Europe. The U.S. is also sending additional aerial refueling tankers, all for a potential expansion of this conflict. The deaths of those Americans, I do think, underline certainly the risks for American troops in the region, but also the sustained ability of Iran to keep firing missiles and drones at American military installations. And I think when you talk to U.S. officials, there's also fear that this could potentially demonstrate Iran's ability to evade American air defenses, something that perhaps they have learned over the course of this more than 4-month conflict. And so the president, I think, certainly has some decisions to make in front of him. This will really test whatever restraint he was feeling. And, he has said up until this point that he would consider starting the war again if Iran killed American troops. But at the same time, you do hear diplomats involved in all of this say that the door is not closed for negotiations. You saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's traveling in Asia. He told reporters overnight that if Iran was willing to negotiate, that, quote, the door remains open, and that the U.S. had been hearing from Iran both directly and indirectly that it remains open to get back to the negotiating table. And so even as you see this back and forth of attacks, last night was the 9th consecutive night of U.S. attacks on Iran. They're hitting ever more sensitive targets, including desalination plants, roads, and bridges. Even amid all of that, you do see these glimmers of hope that negotiations could potentially prevail, all in the hope that this doesn't cascade out of control.
Welcome, everybody. U.S. Central Command says that it has concluded a 9th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. Explosions were heard in cities across the northwest and coastal areas. Iranian state media reporting that its military also launched missiles toward enemy targets. Kuwait's army says that air defenses are responding to drone threats, and in Bahrain saying that their air raid sirens have been activated. Well, meanwhile, the U.S. military is reporting the death of another American service member who was killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. Here's what President Trump had to say about the recent strikes and these troop fatalities.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots are out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little left. They've got some missiles. They've got some drones. They've got some manufacturing ability, not much. We control the Strait. They don't control anything. So we'll see what happens, but we hit them very hard again tonight.
Let's go to CNN's Leila Garagozlu live from Abu Dhabi as she continues to cover this. So Leila, give us a sense of where some of these strikes have actually been focused.
Yeah, so as you said, it is the 9th consecutive day of strikes between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. said that it hit a number of Iranian military targets Sunday night into today, Monday morning. Now, Iranian state media said that there were explosions heard across the southern region of Iran, as well as in the northwestern region of Iran, close to the city of Tabriz. Now, that would be the first time in these 9 days that we're hearing any sort of explosions in that area. Earlier on in this war, in the early months, much of the U.S. and Israeli strikes were focused on the more inland cities like Tehran, Esfahan, and Tabriz. This time around, in these 9 days, these strikes have been really focused on the southern region. Now, the southern region is considered to be Iran's defensive arch. These cities like Bandar Abbas, Ahvaz, and also these islands like Qeshm Island and Harg Island really are part of the way that Iran is able to control the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that's why we're seeing the U.S. really focus its strikes in this southern region. Now, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and who controls it, the IRGC says that the Iranians still control it and that they've closed it. The UK Maritime Authority said that it got a report of a vessel on fire, and the Revolutionary Guards said that they had 2 tankers that they found to be non-compliant and therefore targeted. So really asserting their control over the strait. Now, we're in a very fragile situation between the U.S. and Iran, and there's some serious concern among analysts that I've spoken to about this escalating and expanding if no off-ramp is found. So we're going to have to see what happens over the next week. Paulo?
All right, Leila Garagozlu, thank you so much for all that reporting. As always, appreciate your time. Let's go now to Nega Anga joining me now. She's a visiting fellow with King's College London, and she was a senior advisor at the U.S. State Department and National Security Council. Thank you so much for joining us, Nega. Great to see you again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. So after the U.S. and Iran, they traded strikes for a 9th straight night, as you just heard in Leila's report. Do you see any potential off-ramps right now? I mean, a question that so many are asking, what would de-escalation actually look like?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I think we have to be very realistic. We can't look for some sort of grand political agreement, not even anything close to what the Memorandum of Understanding looked like just a week or so ago. What we need to sort of look for is some sort of emergency operating arrangement for the Hormuz. And I think that's where you're going to have sort of those back channel diplomatic conversations to try to find a solution to essentially the Strait of Hormuz, how it's going to operate, the recognized sort of shipping lanes, who monitors, who clears it, all of those technical details, and essentially kind of like a freeze for freeze sort of approach, so that we move away from, essentially what looks like punishment becoming a strategy. So I do think there is, a small window, and there is that diplomatic off-ramp there. The only sort of disconcerting factor is, there is so much direct military friction right now that this could, this could be a slippery slope into something much larger.
So if in fact there are some of those back channel conversations that you referenced, I'm just curious, who do you think are some of those parties in addition to the U.S. and Iran? Do you think that some of the Gulf nations would be